I'm Caleb Bissinger.
And I'm Rufus Griscom.
And this is The Next Big Idea. Today, Demis Hassabis wants to build superintelligence. Should we trust him? For 3 years, two men met regularly at a pub in a leafy neighborhood in North London.
They'd climb the rickety wooden stairs to the second floor. And there, in a room that was always empty, they'd sink into leather chairs beneath a tarnished chandelier and talk for hours.
One of the men was journalist Sebastian Mallaby. The other was a local boy, chess prodigy who'd grown up to be a video game designer, a neuroscientist, a Nobel laureate in chemistry, and one of the most important and powerful figures in the world of artificial intelligence. His name is Demis Hassabis.
Those conversations, along with interviews with more than 100 people in Demis's orbit, are the grist of Sebastian's new book, The Infinity Machine.
It does all the standard biography stuff, charting Demis's improbable journey to become the guy in charge of Google's AI. But what really got me interested in Sebastian's book is something he writes in the introduction. New kind of intelligence, he says, is being willed into the world by a remarkably small number of people. Each of them is driven by a particular mix of curiosity and hubris, vanity and avarice, idealism and craving. And the sobering reality is that, for better or worse, the quality of their characters will affect society.
So, what motivates Demis? What are his talents, his flaws? What does he think of his rivals? What does he think the world will look like if he succeeds? And if he really believes there's a chance AI could destroy us, why keep building it? These questions affect all of us.
And we'll try to answer them right after the break. And then, Rufus, why don't you come back at the end of the show and you and I can talk about what this all means?
Yeah, let's do that. I mean, I can't get over this notion that there are half dozen people leading the top AI labs in the world, and how they think and what drives them arguably could not be more important.
Today's episode of The Next Big Idea is sponsored by Fabric, Factor, Granola, and Shopify. Fabric by Gerber Life is term life insurance that you can get done today. Apply in minutes at meetfabric.com/NBI. Factor is offering listeners of this show 50% off and free breakfast for a year. Head to factormeals.com/idea50off and use code IDEA50off. Granola is a no-brainer for people in back-to-back meetings. Try it totally free for 3 months. Just head to granola.ai/idea. Start your business today with the industry's best business partner, Shopify. Sign up for your $1 a month trial at shopify.com/NBI. Sebastian, welcome to The Next Big Idea.
So great to be with you.
I have this Post-it note stuck to my notes for this interview here, and it's a quote from Henry Luce, the founder of Time magazine. He believed that what journalists should do, and this is what I've written on the Post-it note, is tell the history of our time through the people who make it. And I think that's what you've done with your new book, The Infinity Machine, about Demis Hassabis. And I think that's what we're going to do over the next hour on the show, is try to tell the history of our time through the people who make it. And so I want to begin by asking how you chose your particular history maker, how you chose Demis. He is not as kind of messianic as Elon Musk. He's not as Machiavellian as Sam Altman. He's not as pugnacious as Dario Amodei. He's not as Pollyanna-ish as Reid Hoffman. So what is it that drew you to him? Why write a book about him?
Partly it was that he was the OG, the first guy to get into this game. You know, he set up DeepMind in 2010, 45 years before OpenAI was founded by Elon and Sam. And even before 2010, he had been dreaming about building AI since he went to college in the mid-1990s at Cambridge University in England. So that was one thing. Through his life story, you can tell the making of modern AI, because he does stretch back to the origins. And then he led all of the stuff that went on really until ChatGPT came out. His lab, DeepMind in London, was clearly the top AI lab in the world. And then there was this exciting fight in the last part of the story, which made it even better because, ChatGPT came out and Google and DeepMind, Demis Hassabis' team were kind of behind. And so there's an exciting catch-up story at the end of the book.
We'll get into that. And part of what made it, I think, particularly painful for Demis and the team at Google was that a lot of what allowed ChatGPT to work was building on research and breakthroughs that Google had made themselves, that DeepMind had made themselves.
But I think actually, that gets to a second good reason to choose Demis as the focus of a story about modern AI, which is that, he led the science. He is the only person who was really at the origin of the science and also a lab leader. Right, you've got people like Geoffrey Hinton in Toronto and, Jan LeCun and Yoshua Bengio, who are sort of great scientists who laid the foundations. But in terms of people who actually founded an organization to build it at scale, Demis was the leader, and, he has a Nobel Prize to prove it. Sam Altman, not a scientist, dropped out of Stanford, very different kettle of fish.
So for almost 3 years, you and Demis met regularly at a pub in North London where he's from, where he lives. And you guys would sip cappuccinos and talk. I think you say that you did something like 30 hours of interviews with him. And then you spoke to at least 100 people in his orbit. And I was really surprised, he came and spoke to you when things were going really well at DeepMind. He came and spoke to you when things were not going very well at DeepMind. And, this is an era where I think we've seen tech CEOs be rather skittish around journalists, right? I think Mark Zuckerberg would much rather go on a comedian's podcast and talk about martial arts than spend 30 hours with a journalist who's going to ask him difficult conversations about the company that he's building. And so what is it about Demis that led him into this project? And what do you think it is about you that made him feel comfortable opening up?
Well, I went and pitched him. I was very lucky. I went and pitched him in November 2022 on the idea of spending super long amounts of time with me so I could write a book about him. And I thought that he was fascinating. I'd known him for a few years at conferences and stuff. I also thought AI was fascinating, a bit niche maybe, but was going to break out at some point. And then a week after I pitched Demis, ChatGPT dropped, and it went from the fringe to the mainstream way faster than I expected. But what I said to him in the pitch was really, two things. First is all of his lectures had been saying for a long time that artificial intelligence would be the most important invention in the history of humanity. So I said to him quite simply, look, if you're right, it follows that you as the creator of AI will be one of the most important people in the history of humanity, which means you don't have a choice. If somebody's going to write a book about you, you may be able to decide which particular writer you spend time with, but you can't negate the reality that there will be books, plural, about you. So let's just get real about that. Second thing I said is, look, if you are going to disrupt human life on the scale that you say with, people bringing up their kids in a new way, because why would they learn to write if chatbots can do it for them? People thinking of themselves as humans in a different way, because we used to define ourselves as the most intelligent species in the world, and now there's this machine intelligence that might surpass us. If you're going to disrupt people from head to toe, you owe them an explanation of why you're doing it. What motivates you? Why do something this dangerous? And unless you provide that explanation, nobody in society is going to accept it. And I presented myself as somebody who, had written other books. I try to understand the people I write about. It's independent, but I'm not out to, knuckle people gratuitously because, I've been around the block. I'm 61. I've done 5 other books. I know that all humans are flawed, including me. And so, I'm going to expose all sides of you, but I'm not going to be vicious and judgmental in excess because I think the world is negative enough anyway, and that's just not my shtick. And so he went with that.
And that idea that all humans are flawed, I feel like is kind of the animating principle of this book. The way you set it up in the early pages, you almost frame it around a question of virtue ethics. Demis does seem to be a good person who has good principles, who is pursuing this for good reasons. And yet his character, his temperament, his integrity, his choice of where to stand in moments of challenge, those things are going to matter not just for him and for his company, but for humanity. And that there's this tension constantly in him between his desire for discovery, his desire for scientific breakthrough, his desire to be good, and the pressures of the market and the pressures of the AI world and the pressures of being perhaps the person who invents the last technology humanity will ever invent. Speak to that. Anything you want to add there?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. That question of whether you can be both great and good is kind of at the core of the book. I think in history, if you look back at people who were termed great, whether it's, Alexander the Great or Catherine the Great or Peter the Great, these are all people who basically led armies and killed a lot of people. So they weren't necessarily good. And in the 20th century, maybe a new tradition began where scientists like Einstein were called great. Maybe other intellectuals, Solzhenitsyn or whatever, winners of Nobel Peace Prizes were called great. But in Demis, we have somebody who not only is a scientist, but he's also a really powerful actor in the world who leads this major lab that's actually making things that change our lives. So it's a bit, not quite back to the military leader, but it's a bit back to the agent, the agentic thinker. And can you be good and great? This is the big question. And I think he struggles with it. And you could, in the end, judge him harshly and say, well, he knows it's dangerous, but he's still building it. He's inflicting it upon us. We can't forgive him for that. Or you could say, well, he represents a version of all of us because we all see technology as both frightening and exciting. And yet we take that trade, we move forward with it, we accept it, because if we didn't, we would still be living in caves. So to some extent, I think understanding Demis is kind of therapy for the rest of us who are going to live through AI. Because when you understand him deeply, you see we are defined by the desire to invent as human beings. And he is part of that, and he's leading us on a frightening ride. But it's kind of human destiny to go there.
Tell me if this has ever happened to you, because I can tell you it's happened to me. You leave a meeting and you think, wow, that was productive. We accomplished so much. We set all these goals. And then 10 minutes later, half hour, you stop and you realize, wait, what am I supposed to be doing? You look back at your notes and it's just kind of a jumble of random keywords that don't make any sense. It's a mess. But Granola fixes that. Granola is an AI-powered notepad built for the way real people actually meet. You take rough notes just like you normally would, but in the background, Granola securely transcribes the meeting, and it turns everything into clean, structured, actually useful notes when the meeting ends. And the best part is that it works through your device's audio, which means it integrates seamlessly into the video conferencing tools you already use. So there's no setup and none of those awkward bots that you end up just kicking out of the meeting. We've been using Granola for months now, and not only does it let all of us just be a little more present in meetings because we're not distractedly trying to take our own notes, but it also creates this incredible living archive of everything we've ever discussed as a team or with external partners. And by the way, it's a beautiful interface. If meetings are eating up your day, Granola is a no-brainer. You can try it totally free for 3 months. Just head to granola.ai/idea. That's granola.ai/idea to get your time back. Get 3 months free at granola.ai/idea.
Folks, there's nothing like the first warm weekends of spring to get me outside exercising. And then I'm reminded we not only need to move our bodies, we also need to fuel them with good food. The challenge so many of us have is that preparing food, real food, takes time. I have discovered, however, a solution. Factor. Fully prepared meals designed by dietitians and crafted by chefs, ready in 2 minutes, no planning, no cooking. Factor delivers quality, functional ingredients, including lean proteins, colorful veggies, whole foods, and healthy fats. No refined sugars, no artificial sweeteners, no refined seed oils. There is incredible variety to choose from. 100 rotating weekly meals to keep things fresh and delicious. My personal favorites include the ginger teriyaki salmon and the shredded chicken taco bowl. Options include high-protein, calorie-smart Mediterranean diet and ready-to-eat salads. Factor is always fresh, never frozen, ready in about 2 minutes, no prep, no stress, so you can actually stick to your nutrition goals as well as everything else you're trying to get done. I've had a great experience with Factor. Give it a try. Head to factormeals.com/idea50off and use code IDEA50OFF to get 50% off and free breakfast for a year. Offer only valid for new Factor customers with code and qualifying auto-renewing subscription purchase. Make healthier eating easy with Factor.
Well, let's take a whirlwind tour through his background. I don't want to spend a ton of time on sort of his youth and young manhood, but I want to just sort of tease out some of the elements of his early life that shaped him and that we can still sort of see alive in his character today. So he's born in North London in 1976. He comes from incredibly modest, humble background, right? Talk a little bit just about his parents. I mean, his mother was, I believe, an orphan.
She lived in Singapore growing up. She's Chinese Singaporean, and she was an orphan for a bit. And I think she was rescued off the streets by a benevolent relative. And she later made her way to London, trained in nursing, and that's where she met a Greek Cypriot Londoner, and that was Demis's father. So you have a kind of classic melting pot, striving lower middle class story. And it's kind of interestingly American, right? You
Yes.
think of these people who come out of nowhere with immigrant backgrounds as kind of a Silicon Valley profile. But in fact, London has that too. In fact, 4/5 of the workers, people with jobs in London, were not born in Britain. I mean, it's really a melting pot kind of place. And Demis's co-founder, by the way, Mustafa Suleiman, was also of immigrant extraction in North London, went to the same school at some point, very Islamic parents, no books in the home, no music. Father was pretty much illiterate in English. So, yeah, these are pretty striking origins for somebody who's going to go and change the world.
My reading of your book is that there's sort of two things that he gets from his parents that we see in him to this day. From his mother, who's a devout Christian, he gets this sort of a compassion, empathy, friendliness. And from his father, Demis you can talk about this, he was a extremely elite and competitive chess player from the age of 4 into his teens. And I think at one point was the second best ranked chess player in the world for his age when he was like 13. And his father is sort of his, not his coach, but sort of his chief cheerleader and also his chief critic during those chess years. And from his dad, he gets this unbelievable, ferocious drive, intensity, competitiveness. And those are kind of at odds with each other in my mind, the sort of wholesome, compassionate, empathetic friendliness and the win-at-all-costs ferocity. Do you see those at war within him and what's winning?
Yeah, I mean, you said that very beautifully. I mean, you're quite right. His mother would tell him it's a bad thing to control other human beings. Don't try to control other human beings. And his father was sort of urging him on to greater glory in chess. And although I think Demis outgrew his father's influence pretty young, like by 15 or so, because Demis was just so clever and so independent, so much an autodidact, and his father wasn't in that league. Nonetheless, that early chess circuit clearly shaped his character. There were wooden boards underneath the table so that one kid couldn't kick the other viciously as that other kid was trying to think about the next move. And it was bitterly competitive. Children bursting out in tears when they lost games and burning out on the chess circuit, going to alcohol. Really, really intense. You asked the question, how did Demis reconcile those two sides?
Yes.
And I think the answer is, he hasn't really. I mean, right at the end of the project, the deal I had with him was, look, this is an independent book, but you're allowed to check the quotes because this is on background. And when I do that deal with people, I always give them a lot of context around the quotes, because otherwise how can they possibly judge what they feel about the quotes? And because Demis is so quotable, I quoted him all over the place. I gave him the whole thing. I just said, look, I'm not promising to change a comma outside the quotes, but I'll listen to any comments you have. And so one of the fights we had a sort of series of exchanges which culminated in a 3-hour meeting in that pub in London, where we really hammered it out on the points of disagreement. But there was one particularly pointed argument where, I'd written that he was controlling. And he said, no, I always told you I didn't want to control people. And I said, yeah, I wrote that you didn't want to control people, but, you're running a big company. You are controlling. You're the smartest guy in the room. You win every argument. You are controlling. And he kind of didn't want to accept that. And that's the tension. By their nature, charismatic people are both going to control others in arguments, and they're probably going to create a kind of desperation on the part of people around them to kind of be in their good books, because the affirmation you get from a charismatic person when they say something good to you is the biggest high emotionally you can get. And at the same time, the suffering you feel as one of his entourage if he criticizes you or argues with you or disagrees with you, he's so powerful at doing that, whether he likes it or not, that you suffer. And so David Silver, one of the leading reinforcement learning AI scientists in the world, who was Demis's friend and worked with him in his first startup as well as at DeepMind, he basically had a nervous breakdown working with Demis and had to go off and spend a year in France, somewhere in the countryside, recuperating after the experience of doing a startup with Demis.
The controlling thing is so interesting to me. It's almost as if maybe that's like a shadow part of his personality that he knows is maybe there, and he's trying desperately to tamp it down and not let it surface.
Well, that's why the figure of his sort of doppelganger, Mustafa Suleyman, his co-founder, who eventually he fired in 2019, is so interesting. Mustafa went off and, ultimately joined Microsoft, and for a while was the, top AI person at Microsoft, although I think just recently maybe he's been slightly made to share that pedestal. But, Mustafa Suleyman is a strong leader in AI in his own right, and had this super close relationship with Demis when they were co-founders, and they would talk every night for an hour or two on the phone and in the early hours of the morning. And
almost big brother, little brother, it felt. Was that wrong in my reading of that?
No, you're quite right. I mean, Mustafa was 8 years younger, and he had not completed college. He was very smart, but he dropped out of Oxford because he was a man of action who wanted to actually go do stuff. And he founded a thing called the Muslim Youth Helpline, driven by that Islamic background, which I talked about before. So, there he was. He was not a trained scientist. He joined DeepMind as kind of the business person and looked up to Demis because Demis was older. Demis had already made some money. Demis was, a PhD scientist. And Demis is Demis. I mean, he's quite an extraordinary guy. So, yeah, Big Brother is right. And ultimately, Mustafa, wants to throw his weight around and be a leader because that's sort of who he is as well. And there wasn't space in the organization for both of them. And Demis ended up pushing him out. Now, Demis would never accept pushing him out. He would argue forever if he was on this podcast with you. No, I didn't. It was just a process. The lawyers led it, my chief of staff, whatever, And it's like, dude, you ran the company. Everything that happened in the company was happening because you'd okayed it. And Mustafa got pushed out. So own it. I mean, come on. It's not unusual for startup founders to part ways after 9 years. No harm, no foul. It's okay. Just say, fine, I get it. I accept it. I did that. No, he won't.
Demis seems to want to be the good guy. Having pushed out your co-founder and your little brother, that's not good for the good guy image.
Yeah, no, I think you're hitting it spot on. I mean, he does have this desire to be good. And, that's where we started our conversation. And yet, in practice, you can't always be good if you're wielding power. You have to make tough decisions, and sometimes you fire someone. I wouldn't say that Demis has very many blind spots at all. I think most of the time he's incredibly honest and lucid about both what's going on, but also what his own motivations and thinking process is. And it all makes total sense. I mean, when it came to why did you get overtaken by OpenAI product-wise, he was very honest, very forthcoming, and very interesting. But just on this specific thing about control, I would say that's one blind spot.
let's just rewind a little bit and put a button on sort of how he ends up where he ends up. So he's this chess prodigy that sort of leads him to a fascination with computers because he's interested in modeling games of chess on computers, and that in turn leads him to an obsession with games, with gaming, with video games, and then ultimately to AI and the interaction between all those things. I think we sometimes feel like because ChatGPT exploded and now AI is everywhere, we sort of forget that people were working on AI for a really long time before it hit the mainstream. And Demis is one of those people. What drew him to artificial intelligence in the first place?
Well, as you said, it was gaming right at the beginning. In the mid-1990s, around 1993 or so, he was admitted to Cambridge University, but he was very young. He was only 16 or so. And so the university said, look, you're intellectually, academically completely ready, but you are very young and you won't have a good time socially. So why don't you just do something else for a bit and then come in a year? So he occupied that year by joining a game design studio and coding up a game called Theme Park, which proceeded to sell more than 5 million copies and made him both rich and a bit of a celebrity. And in fact, the boss of the game design studio was called Peter Molyneux, kind of an OG legend of game design in Britain. And this guy, Peter Molyneux, wrote a check for more than $1 million in today's money and said to Demis, hey, I want you to do the next game with me, skip going to college, stay with the game design studio, and here's your bonus. And remarkably, Demis didn't cash the check, right? More than $1 million. You come from a poor background. You're only 17 or something at the time. Wow.
Yeah.
So he went off preferring science to more money and studied computer science at Cambridge. But what happened at the gaming studio was partly that there was this culture of, staying up late, coding, and then kind of meeting for spaghetti in the kitchen at sort of 4 a.m. and talking. And the talk would be about AI. And Demis, I think was seized by the idea that if a human brain is essentially a computer with electrical signals and synapses and 1 and 0 signals, rather like a silicon computer, whatever the brain can do in terms of being intelligent is something that computers will be able to do one day. And that was sort of the bedrock faith that he developed even before he went to college, and therefore he thought AI would be possible, and therefore he was determined to be the guy who brought it into the world and unlocked all the mysteries of science, particularly physics, which he was passionate about. And so, even when he was 18, 19 at college, he had a piece of paper in his dorm room with his kind of plan for AGI. I don't think he used the term AGI then, but his plan for superintelligence. So it was just really, really early. And you got to remember, AI systems couldn't recognize the photograph of a cat until ImageNet in 2012. So we're talking like 15, 17 years before that, and Demis is already committed to that path.
You just said he kind of thought he could be the guy to solve this. And we were talking earlier about his charisma. So many other people seem to think he's going to be the guy to solve this. So he goes off, gets a PhD at University College London. There he meets Shane Legg, who will be one of his co-founders at DeepMind, along with Mustafa Suleyman, who we just mentioned earlier. They start this company in 2010. And before long, Mark Zuckerberg is trying to buy DeepMind. Elon Musk wants to buy DeepMind and fold it into Tesla. Google ultimately prevails and buys DeepMind. And at that point, DeepMind they don't have a killer product. They don't have tons of, research breakthroughs under the hood. Like, it's kind of just their brains that these companies are bidding for. And yet all of these people are convinced, like, these might be the guys who are finally going to crack the code on AGI. What was it about him and his co-founders that had convinced these people, from Elon to Zuckerberg to the folks at Google, this is the guy?
So I think a lot of people who meet Demis Hassabis think, this is the guy. He just has that magic.
Did you think that when you met him?
I did. I thought he was remarkable. I didn't realize the full depth of how interesting he is, how he can switch from discussion of philosophy to movies to theoretical physics to neuroscience, and he'll do it all seeming totally intelligible, approachable, non-arrogant, friendly. He's like the guy next door, chatting about, hey, I think it's time to wash up the dishes after lunch, except that he's talking about these mind-blowing concepts. It's quite a remarkable mixture. So I think that's the first thing. His colleagues in his first startup used to joke that he was the Jedi because he would stare you in the eyes and say, you will believe these things. And then people did believe them. So he has a kind of magic. But in addition to that, more seriously and scientifically, what DeepMind did very early was to fuse the two central traditions in artificial intelligence research. The first one is deep learning, which is essentially learning from enormous quantities of data and trying to find patterns in that data. And that's what underpins the early ChatGPT versions, much later on. But the second kind of artificial intelligence is called reinforcement learning, and that is learning from experience. The system tries an action, it gets a feedback signal from its environment, so it might be playing a game, for example, and it plays a game, plays move, the opponent plays a move, and at the end it either wins or loses, and that's a feedback signal which helps it to understand if its moves that it tried were good. And by repeating millions and millions of games, it gets a lot of feedback signals. And then that is how it learns stuff from trial and error and feedback. So these were two separate traditions historically in AI. They were embodied by Geoffrey Hinton at Toronto, and then Richard Sutton, the sort of father of reinforcement learning, who was based in Edmonton in Canada. So two British scientists, both of them operating out of Canadian colleges. And there was a scientist called Vlad Ni of Ukrainian extraction, a Canadian Ukrainian, and he had done graduate work with both of these two traditions, and DeepMind hired him. And because of Vlad and because of others also who were minded to try and bring together the two traditions, that's what they pulled off with the Atari game-playing system, which they did in 2012. That was a breakthrough. I mean, it was kind of ImageNet, which was the ability to recognize photographs. ImageNet was pure deep learning. And what DeepMind contributed was an ImageNet equivalent, but for agentic systems, which were using reinforcement learning in addition to deep learning.
I should say as an aside, there's this really funny moment in the book where Demis is starting DeepMind and he's trying to raise money. And one of his investors says, you have to come to my house and you have to pitch me and my wife and my 14-year-old son, and we all get a vote, and you have to convince three of us if I'm going to write a check into your business. And Demis is like, oh my God, I have to explain this to a 14-year-old kid? I am that 14-year-old kid. So when you're talking about the Atari system, it's basically like they're using deep learning in order to allow this AI to see and understand the gameplay, and then they're using reinforcement learning for it actually to play and through trial and error figure out what are good moves and what are bad moves. Is that how those two overlap?
Yeah, I mean, that's the start of the explanation. I mean, Demis had, done his PhD, interestingly, not in computer science, but in neuroscience. And his reason for that was he wanted to understand how human intelligence worked, because that was the existence proof for artificial intelligence being possible. And one of the big ideas he got from doing neuroscience is that intelligence consists of many different components inside the brain, right? So you have the hippocampus and the cerebellum and so forth and so forth. And in layman's terms, there are different bits of the brain, some of which do planning, some of which do, memory, some of which do imagination and so forth. And what's really magical is when you put them all together and they interact really cleverly. That produces real intelligence. And so with Atari, they were applying that intuition. And so, for example, one of the things that they did was that the system would play many, many games to try to get feedback signals about whether moves were good or bad. So you've got all these moves and you've got all these feedback signals, and then you want to learn from those pairs of action reward what moves will lead you to victory in the future. And for complicated reasons I won't get into, but the system won't learn well if it tries to derive conclusions in real time with each feedback signal, and because it will over-index on sort of one micro part of the game where your paddle is stuck in the top right-hand corner. It's doing these repetitive shots in the top right, and that will kind of mislead it. What you do is you collect like 1 million different pairs of action reward. You put them in a memory bank, and then you have a bunch of data in the memory bank, and then you can do deep learning as if it was ImageNet recognizing a photograph on top of all those stored experiences. It's quite a subtle series of ways of combining the idea of reinforcement learning to collect win-lose feedback, and then deep learning on top of a memory bank of those results to produce a game system that wins.
Just a minute ago, you were saying it's a almost dizzying experience spending time with Demis because he'll be talking about a movie, and then he's talking about theoretical physics, and then he's talking about biology. Like, he just sees this all as part of this stew that he lives and thinks in. I'm thinking about that because you're also now saying that you have these oil and water camps, right? Deep learning, reinforcement learning, they're completely separate tribes. And Demis says these can be united, these can overlap, and these can intermingle, much as he does in conversation, connecting threads from all. Like, do you think does that say something about the way he thinks, the way he sees the world?
100%. I think he's Mr. Anti-silo, right? He's super cross-disciplinary. And actually, over the holidays at the end of last year, I was having a break between finishing this book and then needing to come on podcasts and talk about it. And I read a book called Range by David Epstein.
Yeah.
And, it makes the point that a lot of the people who do the best, whether it's in sports or in music or in lots of fields, they have range. They don't just specialize in one thing and do whatever it is, 3,000 hours of practice, and then they're great. That's the kind of the Malcolm Gladwell learning, and maybe I got the number wrong, but the point is, dogged specialization wins. No, it doesn't win, actually. Experimentation, allowing you to bring inspiration from one subject into another one, tends to do better if you're really going for excellence, and Demis embodies that.
Here's my personal approach to insurance. I don't need it for small stuff like electronics or flights. Over time, the math doesn't work, but it does make sense for the big stuff: health, home, and life insurance. Life insurance isn't something you buy for yourself. You buy it for the people you love and who rely on you, so they're not scrambling. They're covered. They have less to worry about in an already difficult, unexpected time. Fabric by Gerber Life makes it easy to give them that. Fabric by Gerber Life is term life insurance you can get done today. Made for busy parents like you, all online, on your schedule, right from your couch. You could be covered in 10 minutes, often with no health exam required. If you've got kids, especially if you're young and healthy, the time to lock in low rates is now. There's no risk, there's a 30-day money-back guarantee, and you can cancel at any time. Fabric also has free digital wills, tools to invest in your kids' future, and more, all right from your phone. Join the thousands of parents who trust Fabric to help protect their family. Apply today in just minutes at meetfabric.com/NBI. Meetfabric.com/NBI. And use my link so they know I sent you. meetfabric.com/NBI. Policies issued by Western Southern Life Assurance Company, not available in certain states. Prices subject to underwriting and health questions. My wife thinks I have an online shopping habit. She would say addiction. I think that's a strong word. It's true I've been taken lately with beautiful spoons and spatulas made of wood, running shoes, colorful backpacks. We all have our weaknesses. The frustration, of course, comes when you find the perfect item and then you see the dreaded credit card entry page. Such a chore. Then you sometimes see the purple pay button that has all your information saved, making checkout as simple as a tap on your screen. Shopify makes checkout easy. It's the commerce platform behind millions of businesses around the world and 10% of all e-commerce in the U.S., from household names like Allbirds, Cotopaxi, and Gymshark to brands just getting started. Shopify is your e-commerce expert with world-class expertise in everything from managing inventory to international shipping to processing returns and beyond. See less carts go abandoned and more sales go with Shopify and their Shop Pay button. Sign up for your $1 per month trial today at shopify.com/NBI. Go to shopify.com/NBI. That's shopify.com/NBI.
So if we're thinking about the breakthroughs and the innovations that have made DeepMind sort of the cornerstone of modern AI, one is uniting deep learning and reinforcement learning, as you just described. Another is embracing the transformer, embracing transformer architecture, which is something that emerges out of Google, I think, in 2017, and DeepMind embraces. Describe what that technology is, why it's so significant to today's AI.
Sure. So with ImageNet, which was sort of the big breakthrough for images, what the system was really doing was understanding that each pixel in a photograph is probably going to be related to the pixels right next to it because, they're both part of the cat's tail or something. And that intuition that there is a relationship between different bits of the puzzle you're trying to solve is helpful in narrowing down the search space that you have to conquer when you're figuring out what the picture is. Now, in sequential data, think about, a text, lots of words. Different words in the sentence will relate to each other in different ways. It's not the same as a picture where you kind of have clusters of related pixels, because also in a sentence you might have a reference back to something that happened in the previous sentence. If I say, I dropped my keys, and then the second sentence is, I can't get into my house without them. The them is the pronoun that makes no sense unless you can relate it back to the first sentence. And so to unravel the meaning of sequential data, and that could also be not just text, it could be the clips in a movie, it could be the ticker numbers in a stock market. Any sequential data, you need to figure out the relationship between the different bits in the sequence. And to make a long story short, the point about the transformer innovation was it was the first time you could really solve the meaning of big amounts of sequential data. You could put a whole book into a transformer and it would understand all of the interrelationships in that sequence. You could put, a whole movie and, etc. And so really that was the significance of the 2017 paper.
And it brings speed to the process, right? Because it doesn't have to understand things token by token, word by word, because that would be an incredibly slow and time-consuming and laborious process for an AI to go about understanding a book if it's taking it token by token. And the transformer allows it to sort of see it almost in multidimensional space and therefore understand it and engage with it much, much, much faster.
Correct. And the funny thing was that the GPU chips that were being used by this point, ubiquitously for AI, had this feature that they could parallelize operations. And yet that ability to parallelize things hadn't been fully exploited until the transformer model came along. And then the transformer architecture, ironically tackled sequences without paying attention to the order in which these sequences played out. They were able to feed enormous amounts of text, kind of different bits of that text simultaneously would be processed. And you didn't have to do it sequentially. And that liberation, as you're suggesting, was why you could suddenly deal with way more data much, much faster because you weren't doing it ploddingly, one token after the other.
How did all this coalesce to allow Demis and DeepMind to solve the problem of protein folding?
Well, that was very interesting because the original impetus for taking on protein folding, aside from the fact that Demis had been personally fascinated by it since he was at college, because a friend of his had mentioned the protein folding problem back when he was
while they were playing table football, right?
Yeah, exactly.
One night as a stray comment at a bar.
Yeah, that's right. And that's kind of how Demis says he operates, right? He's a magpie. He collects these bits of interesting challenge or information, puts them in the back of his mind, and then bang, something happens later, could be a long time later, and he says, oh, I remember, this is now the right time to take on that thing I heard about in the college bar when I was 19. And so the moment this aha moment came that this was the right time was when DeepMind had defeated the South Korean Go champion in a kind of exhibition match in Seoul. And the system called AlphaGo had defeated the human, and Demis was walking out of the exhibition hall where the game took place with his friend David Silver, who I mentioned earlier as having had a nervous breakdown, but by this time they'd patched it up and they were working again together. And coming down the street in Seoul, and we know this because coincidentally there was a camera with a microphone kind of following them, and this was picked up. Demis says, we've done that, we've solved Go. So the next thing is we can solve protein folding. And what he meant was that Go had this immense combinatorial space, right? You have 19 by 19 on the board. That means there's 361 squares. That means the first move, there's 361 possibilities. And then the second, there's 360 and so forth. And very soon you multiply all these options together, move, counter move, counter move, and you get to this impossibly large number of combinations. To solve that game had been a grand challenge in computer science precisely because of the huge combinatorial complexity. And the point about protein folding was that with protein folding, you have this strip of amino acid, and on it there's the DNA code. And the DNA code governs how it's going to do a self-executing origami shape. The strand of amino acid folds itself up into a super complex, intricate shape. And then these are the building blocks of nature. And to predict the shape just from the amino acids means predicting a shape that could be one of billions, trillions, massive numbers of possible shapes, because each little atom can twist either way. And so it's just enormously complicated. But Demis's point was, hey, if we solved Go, which was a big combinatorial space, the next thing is obviously AlphaFold. And there you see precisely how you can't pigeonhole him. It goes from games to structural biology in the same breath. So he sets DeepMind to work on this. And the first idea is, David Silver, having conquered Go with reinforcement learning, would apply reinforcement learning to AlphaFold, to the idea of protein folding, and they would have the same recipe. And after not very long, like 6 months or so, they quickly understand that that's not going to work. And they basically go through a series of experiments where they pivot and another thing doesn't work and they pivot again. And along the way, there emerges this young scientist called John Jumper, who had been obsessed with protein folding forever. And he brought in the transformer model. I guess this was sort of 2018, 2019, when he brought it in. And so it had been invented a year or year and a half before. And he decided that the sequences of the DNA on the amino acid strands, which make up protein, could be subjected to a transformer model style sequential modeling tool. He used the transformer and he threw out the reinforcement learning. There was no reinforcement learning in AlphaFold. And so, what I think is interesting about the story, when all the pivots that went into it and finally, solving all of the shapes in nature and getting a Nobel Prize for it, is that this achievement completely belies the nonsense that some people say, where they say, well, the labs aren't doing algorithmic innovation. They are merely scaling. They're just obsessed with building bigger and bigger data centers.
Right.
There's no real invention, nonsense. This was exactly the opposite. There was enormous algorithmic experimentation, pivoting, and innovation.
This is also an area where what will flow from it will be profound for human beings, right? It's not just creating funny videos. It's going to unlock drug discovery, advance medicine. So the consequences for humanity of figuring out protein folding are remarkable and not to be underestimated. You've alluded to this already in the conversation, but there's this sort of, DeepMind's kind of riding high. They've figured out protein folding. And yet it's OpenAI, a lab started by Sam Altman and Elon Musk, in part because they didn't trust Google and Demis to be the only people building and potentially controlling AGI. And it's OpenAI using some of the breakthroughs that DeepMind had made to create and launch ChatGPT, something that DeepMind was not even really particularly focused on building a large language model, an LLM, at the time that ChatGPT launched. What was going on? Was Demis just asleep at the wheel? Like, how did they? I mean, that in retrospect, it looks like a pretty big blind spot.
Right. And I would ask him this, repeatedly when we were up there on the top floor of that pub in the kind of secret room that nobody knew about, and it was just the two of us, and we had 2 hours together each month. And, the most interesting part of the answer as to why he missed this and let OpenAI get ahead went back to his studies of neuroscience, because in neuroscience there is an idea called action and perception, which basically says that intelligence requires the intelligent agent to act in the world. You won't know what gravity is until you've felt it, until you've dropped an object and see it fall to the floor. You wouldn't know the difference between sort of liquid and solid unless you had a glass of water and you tipped it and then the liquid fell out and splashed. You need to understand the physical world, and that's how humans do a lot of their learning, and therefore, by extension, artificial intelligence will either need to be robotic and act in the world, or at the minimum, act in game simulations of the real world. And so Demis was pursuing that vision of how you get to superintelligence, and he had a fascinating project called Gaia. The idea was to build a simulation of the natural environment, which is way more irregular and complex to act in than a man-made environment. There's no right angles in nature. You get these enormous trees and tiny, blades of grass. It's super irregular and therefore very hard to impose categories on it. And that's something which is part of what intelligence beings do. They kind of classify objects to understand the world. So the idea was to build Gaia and get to superintelligence that way. And then another project he had going on was an agent that played the real-time multiplayer game StarCraft 2. And the point again was that this is a super complicated game which requires you to plan over long horizons. You can't see the whole landscape. You have to therefore act in a fog of uncertainty. Can an AI agent handle that, was the question. And in the meantime, what he was not doing so much was focusing on language. And his view was, look, language is a system of symbols. And you can understand symbols, great, but we know from action and perception and neuroscience that ain't enough. That won't get you to superintelligence. And he basically persisted in this conviction. And then 2020, GPT-3 came out. And that was really quite a strong model. And suddenly Demis said, wow, okay, I was wrong. We need to catch up. We're going to do language big time. And he threw a ton of resources and started to try to catch up.
In that effort to catch up, it does seem like Demis had to betray some of his principles about how AI should scale, right? He's always been aware that if things go right with this technology, it will be wonderful for humanity, but there are very real risks that it goes wrong, and if it does, it will be catastrophic. And so he's always been concerned about safety, speed, avoiding a race condition where you have multiple labs racing each other and taking big risks. And all of a sudden, he finds himself thrust into this world where, oh my gosh, we're on our back foot. We got to catch ChatGPT. And now they have another new model coming out and it's better than ours. And oh my gosh, Anthropic just released this model. It's incredible. And oh my God, the Chinese just released this lightweight model and it's maybe better than, like, all of a sudden he has to, we've been talking since the beginning. Can you be good and can you also be great? That tension is right there, right? He has to decide, do I get into this race because that's what the company wants and that's what the company needs? But does that mean sacrificing some of my principles around safety and speed?
Yeah, and we saw an example of that actually just last week when DeepMind released a new suite of its open weight light models called Gemma. And the reason that's revealing is that, Demis has said to me, look, open source models can be very dangerous because people can download them, modify them, do whatever they want with them, and you can't control that. Whereas if you serve them a proprietary model, A, they can't mess around with the safeguards you've put on it. And B, if they start to use it for a cyber attack or something, you can switch it off. And so you give up those things with open weight, and yet he's going ahead with open weight. So that really illustrates how he's doing stuff that he himself would recognize to be suboptimal for safety. And, the big, I think, interesting, exciting, terrifying thing to be watching in this AI race right now is how all of the different lab leaders process this position that they are in, because they're all in it. And we saw Dario Amodei from Anthropic pick a fight with the Pentagon and try and assert some principles about how AI is used for mass surveillance or for autonomous lethal weapons. Basically, he got rolled, indeed attacked by the Pentagon, and he's having to fight law cases to protect the understanding of whether American labs can work with him or not. So, you could say he made a principled stand, but you could also say, not clear it changed the world for the better, and it might have damaged his company, although I think hopefully he'll be fine. Sam Altman, on this very day that we're recording, Monday, has just put out a big essay about how to manage the kind of labor market disruption and inequality increases that will come from AI. And so he's making a public stand about it. Demis believes, I think at least as strongly as either of them, and probably a lot more strongly than Sam does, that he wants to be good and that he would like AI to be beneficial for society. And he built AlphaFold, and by the way, gave it to the world. It's totally open source. Any scientist in the world can use it for free. He does this because that is AI for the good. It's going to advance medicine for the good. And he's very proud of that, and rightly so. But what's the sensible, smart, and actually positively consequential stand that he could make on AI safety? It's tough because, he could say, look, I'm building artificial intelligence in the context of this race dynamic, and it's pushing me to go too fast. That's not safe, so I quit. I'm going to take a professorship at Princeton. Well, that wouldn't make the world safer. Somebody else would just carry on racing, right? That has zero impact on making the world a better place. So would it be good to back up Dario Amodei's stand and try to play hardball with the military industrial complex? Well, Dario got rolled. Not clear that's going to really produce much. And I think what Demis is most likely to do, and if he's doing this, it'll be behind the scenes and we won't see it explicitly, is to try to persuade other governments, maybe starting with Britain's, that in the end, the only way we make this technology safe is by governments collaborating together. Because in a collective action problem, if two labs decide to make their technology only usable for very safe purposes, and then there are 8 other labs that ignore that, you haven't made anything safer. So you need to enforce safety standards on all the labs, at least the leading edge ones, at once. And that requires the government to be pushing the safety standards onto the industry. And so I think Demis will be making those arguments behind the scenes and hoping that, the political configuration we have in the world, which isn't best configured right now for safety, may change.
I don't know if you, Sebastian, watch a lot of reality TV. Something tells me you probably don't.
I don't.
There's something they do on these shows called a confessional, where they take one cast member and they put them in a room with the cameras and they ask them to sort of say what they really think about the other cast members on the show. If we were to do that with Demis and we said, what do you really think about your rivals, Dario, Sam, Elon? What do you think he would say?
Well, I've done that with him. And, what he says is that Sam wants power. Sam thought of running for governor of California. There's rumors that he even wanted to run for president. His objective function is power. And that's how he sees Sam. And that's not something he says with respect. He doesn't like people who are trying to maximize power. I think about Mark Zuckerberg, he would say that guy wants money. He wants to maximize the shareholder value. He wants Meta to roll out even more addictive products with the help of AI. I think, Elon is an interesting one because Elon's record on this is so double standards and hypocritical, right? Mm-hmm. He was very, very outspoken at various times about the existential risk posed by AI. And yet he's also very, very determined to race and have XAI be a leading player in the field. And he's both. He's an accelerationist and a doomster at once. I think for whatever reason, Demis doesn't like to criticize Elon. partly because maybe Elon has such a megaphone that poking the bear is unwise.
Yeah.
I'm speculating there, but there have been times when Elon would go around saying, well, Demis Hassabis is an evil genius, and he's going to destroy us all, and that's why we need to have OpenAI as a counterweight to DeepMind. And Demis doesn't want to reignite that kind of talk. So, he's a bit tactful about Elon.
One of the things that's interesting to me with Demis, the way that he talks about this technology is different than those guys. It's different from Sam or Elon, which is that it's infused with a kind of religiosity. It's infused with a kind of faith. And he says to you that his pursuit of AGI is a spiritual endeavor, that it's about trying to get close to God, I think is the word he uses. Does that draw from the faith that he grew up with his mother? Where does that come from? To me, that's highly unusual, this sense that he's driven not by power, not by wealth, but by faith.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, it's true he did grow up with a religious mother. He did pray in the evenings as a child. He did sing in the choir at the church. And he has that tradition, which probably makes it more natural for him to reach for religious terms, spiritual terms, to describe what he feels about his scientific quest to understand nature. I mean, we talked about this at some length, and sometimes he would try and discourage me from seeing him as spiritual, although he confessed that he did feel it was spiritual, but he didn't want me to overdo that, because what he was saying was, look, I'm a scientist primarily. I want to understand nature, and I choose to sometimes describe that incredibly intense urge to understand nature as being a kind of quest for quasi-spiritual understanding. And I'm not the only one to do this, Demis would carry on. He said, Einstein talked about the god of Spinoza being the 17th century European philosopher who said that, nature is God's creation, and to understand nature as a scientist will get you closer to understanding God. And Demis feels that. And I have scientific friends who are nothing to do with this book, but who, when I describe this to them, say, oh yeah, I feel the same. So I think it's not that unusual for scientists, particularly who are doing things like theoretical physics, to be so passionate as to be spiritual about it. And I think the last thing to say about this is that what we're skirting around here is the topic of how do human beings process the enormity of AGI, of being the one to discover AGI. And, some of the time what I observed was people had weird reactions. So Shane Legg, the co-founder of DeepMind, gave a famous lecture, which was where he actually bonded with Demis Hassabis for the first time. And this was in 2009, and it was about AI risk. Back in 2009, it was about the possibility that AI would become sufficiently powerful to threaten human existence. And as Shane is delivering this lecture, and I could watch it on a video, which exists on the internet, you could see him smiling, and his eyes are kind of glowing, and he kind of giggles. And as he describes more intense existential risk, that giggle gets more prominent. And you think, what is going on? Why is it funny to talk about potential human annihilation? And the fact is that when we humans contemplate our own annihilation, it feels absurd, and the absurd is a close cousin of humor. And so you laugh. That came up a bit in my research. And then another way of processing the enormity of what's going on is to really sort of reach for religious symbols and language. And so there's this moment when Ilya Sutskever is talking to his fellow scientists at OpenAI at a company retreat. There's a fire pit, and it's the evening. And Ilya produces a kind of effigy and puts it in the fire and said, this stands for the evil AGI. And when the evil AGI comes, we have to burn it. And they burned the effigy. And it was a sort of super kind of culty, religious feeling thing, And so I think the symbolism of religion is somehow what we turn to describe the ineffable nature of a superintelligence that's super hard to get your head around otherwise.
Despite the ineffable nature of AGI, Demis remains cautiously optimistic. That's the phrase he uses with you. Why do you think that is? Like, how do you think he's managed to justify that position, given what he knows about the potential risks and dangers here?
I think some of it is that you have to say you're optimistic if you're going to carry on. You have to justify yourself, come up with a rationale for what you're doing. But I think also there is a Rorschach test which goes on with the prospect of AGI when people compare their so-called probability of doom, the p-doom. How likely is it that humans would be wiped out or partially wiped out by AGI? And I think where people land on that spectrum of p-doom depends on their temperament. And, someone like Geoffrey Hinton, the father of deep learning, is very, very doomsterish. But I know former PhD students of his who say that he was doomsterish about the prospect of bioterrorism before AI became powerful enough to worry about. He always had something that he was terrified of. That just rings true to me. When I get up every morning, although analytically I see the case for being very worried about the robots attacking us, and we can go into why I think that, but I really do think there's a non-zero risk that this could happen. I can't feel upset on a daily basis. I just get up. I like the world. I like my job. I like my friends. I have a great time. I feel optimistic. And so I'm optimistic still, to parrot Demis. And maybe he's got that optimism, which is kind of a requirement for an entrepreneur. And when you have that, of course, you're optimistic still.
You can't tease us with that. What is your p-doom? How worried are you about the circumstance where the robots rise up against us? And then maybe also on the flip side, I mean, Demis is quite convincing in this book about what the beautiful, abundant post-AGI world could look like if we get it right. So maybe play those two against each other.
Sure. I mean, I think the upside abundance, I broadly agree with, at least in the longer term. So, I think AGI or even just powerful AI is going to accelerate scientific discovery. That's going to be terrific for medicine. It's going to unlock a lot of new learning and information for lots of people. It's going to maybe help materials science, which could in turn lead to inventions that reduce climate change. I mean, for example, nuclear fusion as a source of fuel has made strides in recent years, not least because of AI and the way that both AI can help you to invent new materials that are good for fusion reactions and also can help you to suspend the nuclear plasma in the reactor magnetically. You need a very sophisticated magnetic control function, and reinforcement learning turns out to be a way of creating one. So I think the sort of abundant story is certainly true for scientific progress, and I think largely probably true for just general human lives, because I think that we will, as humans, invent new things to be passionate about, to give our lives meaning. We will compete at games, we will do art, we will occupy ourselves productively and stimulate ourselves. And so I don't buy the story that, when we have no jobs, we decline into depression. I think we'll figure that out because of just the way we are wired. Now, on the downside, I spent a lot of time during my project. I spent more than 3.5 years doing this. And for most of that time, I was wandering around saying, yeah, sure, the machines will be more intelligent than humans, but they're not wired to compete with us. I mean, humans evolved over millennia to survive, to fear risks, and to fight to survive, to pass on our DNA. And that was our most basic objective function. And machines don't have that. They're not evolved, and they don't necessarily want to survive. And so why would they pick a fight with us? And in fact, Demis had told me about this series of books he read, the science fiction books called the Culture series by Ian Banks, where in an AGI future, you have all these AGIs that are, doing their own stuff. They have their own political intrigues, they play their own chess matches, they do their own space exploration, and the humans live alongside them without being bothered by them, and it's all perfectly amicable. And I kind of thought, well, I don't want to I don't want to anchor my view on science fiction, but I do see that. And then I went to Toronto one day and I sat in Geoffrey Hinton's kitchen for 2 hours, and we debated why Geoffrey Hinton, having invented deep learning academically, is so pessimistic about what that's going to do to us today. And I came armed with this knowledge that, on the Rorschach test I mentioned earlier, he had always been super pessimistic. So, maybe he was just overdoing it. And we had this debate where he basically explained to me why AI is going to want to survive. And therefore, I shouldn't be so optimistic. And what he said was, look, supposing you create a very powerful AI and you're worried that it's going to be subject to a cyber attack by an enemy AI. You need to defend your own AI, but a human brain is not fast enough to protect against an AI-generated cyber attack. So you're going to have to empower your own AI to defend itself against the attacking AI. And you're going to have to tell your own AI, you need to survive here. Bang! You just did it. You gave it a survival instinct. And then there are all these experiments, by the way, that come out of the red teaming of models before they're released. And, I think both Anthropic and OpenAI have released descriptions of some of these cases where not only does the AI want to survive, not only is it more intelligent than us in many ways, but it also lies to us. It's very capable of obfuscation and dissembling. And you put those three things together, superintelligence, survival instinct, and devious obfuscation, it feels like analytically I can't be confident that we're not going to be attacked.
That's certainly a grim place, an important message, but a grim message to land on. Why don't we close with this? After 3+ years of working on this book, are you any closer to an answer on the question of whether it is possible to be both good and great?
I'd say the answer depends on how you judge people. If you want them to be utterly pure and constant in their principles and never controlling of anyone, then it's impossible to be both great and good. If you're willing to say, well, in the real world, people need to adjust their principles, they need to be pragmatic about when you take a principled stance, for example, on safety, and how you do it. Don't use up your capital by taking a stance that wouldn't actually change outcomes in the real world, which I personally find compelling because I think judging somebody in the abstract, sort of separated from how the real world functions, is just not useful. I mean, we surely ought to be judged as human beings in the context of the world in which we live. And if you do that, then I think you can be sort of good on a relative basis, which ends up just being good. So I'm willing to say that Demis Hassabis is both great and good.
The book is The Infinity Machine. Sebastian, it's been really wonderful talking with you today. Thanks so much.
I've enjoyed it so much, Caleb. Thank you.
Rufus, thoughts, initial reactions to that one?
So fascinating. I mean, Demis Hassabis is one of the most interesting people alive on the planet today.
Totally.
And, I come back to this question of like, okay, as Demis says, we've got a half dozen people running the leading frontier model AI companies in the world. This might be critical to the future of our species. It seems like a lot of smart people think so. And so the question of what motivates these people is critical. And Demis says, Sam Altman wants power, Zuck wants money, Elon, as far as I can tell, wants to take us to Mars.
Yeah.
And so what does Demis want? And it seems like he wants to solve science. He wants a single elegant answer to the great mystery of the universe. Seems like a better motivator, but I don't know. What do you think? How does that play out?
No, I think you're exactly right. I do think that's what he's after. And he says as much to Sebastian. And yes, I do think that is certainly I don't know what the right word is, like kind of pure motive, a more inspiring motive, but not one without risks and not one without hubris. Demis is hell-bent on solving science, and that means that he's willing to do things that he knows could cause irreparable harm to the human species in that pursuit. So it's a double-edged sword, for sure.
Right. I mean, if you're obsessed with finding the elegant answer, the hypothetical elegant answer to the great mystery of life, of existence. What are you willing to give up to get to that answer, right? What are you willing to risk for all of us? It does seem, though, that Sebastian comes out on the side of feeling like certainly Demis is one of the very best actors in this conversation.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. And I think, that partly is because he's a scientist, and it's also just how he's wired, right? I love the detail in the conversation that when Demis was, 15, 16 years old, he's given a check for the equivalent of $1 million in today's money to go and work at this video game company. And he says, no, I'm not going to take your money. I mean, that's a huge sum for a kid in that era who's come from a very humble background. And that tells us a lot about his character, I think.
It sure does. It sure does. No, that's an extraordinary detail. And, Sebastian describes, I think, really nicely the quandary that Demis is in. He can't simply be a conscientious objector and
yes. Ooh, great phrase.
Slow down development. He can't not participate in the advance of this technology. That's not necessarily the responsible action. But this quandary that Demis is in is at the same time the quandary that we're all in. There's a game theory problem here. And my hope is, as a game theorist, as someone who's game obsessed, that Demis is trying to think through that game theory problem of how do we, if no one's willing to apply brakes to this process and think through, a few moves ahead, what's the outcome?
Yeah, no, this is a person who grew up honing this ability to think into the future, to think multiple steps ahead. And so I'm hopeful that early training benefits humanity as Demis now participates in this massive chess game of building artificial intelligence.
Which some would see as a chess game in which we have humans on one side and neural networks built on silicon on the other side. And I, for one, am glad that we've got Demis on our side of the board.
All right, well, we'll leave it there. Today's episode was produced by me, Caleb Bissiger. Our executive producer is Rufus Griscom. We'll be back on Thursday.